democratisation bringing Australia and Indonesia closer together, and what are the issues? We have two very learned speakers on this topic, both with experience on the ground in West Papua. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Camelia Webb Gannon, who she's co-ordinator of the West Papua project at Sydney University, who also has experience in the field.
Everybody's fascinated by a cannibal story, particularly one purported to have nearly taken place in the past decade. In 2006, Channel 9's 60 Minutes aired a program cameoing Wawa, a then 6-year-old boy they encountered during a so-called first contact encounter with members of West Papua's Korowai people. Wawa, 60 Minutes alleged, was facing imminent cannibalisation by his Kombai tribe for suspicion of witchcraft. A media fiasco followed, featuring Channels 9 and 7 racing to produce a rescue Wawa story. But when 7's Naomi Robson was deported from West Papua for using a tourist visa, Wawa was eventually removed from his home by Channel 9's Sumatran tour guide and was taken to live in Jayapura, West Papua's largest city, and then later to Sumatra. So a couple of weeks ago, it was made known to me by a 60 Minutes journalist seeking an anthropologist with West Papua expertise, and I'm not an anthropologist, but they got in touch with me anyway. They told me that a follow-up piece on Wawa and the Korowai, something looking at a diachronic analysis, the Korowai then and now, was being considered. And the idea was to take Wawa from his new home in Sumatra and to return him temporarily to Korowai land. They wanted to ask Wawa to compare his new school and city life with that of his village of origin, and to see how Korowai ways of life, including the practice of cannibalism, may have changed. So I open with this vignette because it is illustrative of the entrenched ignorance and racism that pervades the mainstream Australian imaginary of West Papua and other parts of Melanesia. Anthropologist Rupert Stash, the world's preeminent scholar on the social practices of the Korowai tribe in West Papua, visited Wawa's people after the Wawa media maelstrom. And through conversation with those who knew Wawa, he found out that there was, and I quote from Rupert, there was a predictably wide gulf between the representations that had circulated in the international media and the boy's actual history as understood by his kin and co-villagers, who had no awareness of the media coverage. Almost all persons that Rupert spoke with said that the exclusive reason the first film crew's guide had been approached by villagers about taking the orphan to town was so that he could go to school, become literate in Indonesian, and return as a teacher, nurse, or government official. These numerous persons matter-of-factly denied Rupert's suggestions that the boy had been rumoured to be a witch or had been in danger of being killed, and that's the end of the quote. So first contact tourism and journalism is sensationalist, it's primitivist, and with regard to the Korowai, it's misleading. German missionaries have proselytised to the Korowai in 1979, and the Korowai are knowing, if far from equal, agents in the marketing of their culture to outsiders. The removal of children from their families of origin by Western journalists chasing TV ratings is ethically highly questionable. Yet, despite the deserved ridicule and informed criticism directed at 60 Minutes after its 2006 West Papua foray, it is still contemplating renewing its portrayal of racist stereotypes of West Papuans and manipulating Wawa through a media-instigated form of social engineering. Not only do media depictions such as this serve to uphold the perjuring colonial project in West Papua, they also support the Australian media military complex, providing a veneer of justification for Australian training of Indonesian security forces that in turn keep in check the primitive, violent peoples of Stone Age Papua. And I'm saying that in scare quotes. So the question put to me to consider for this talk on Australia-Indonesia relations was, from the perspective of West Papua, is democratisation bringing Australia and Indonesia closer? And I wondered, not just facetiously, did that mean democratisation in Indonesia or democratisation in Australia? Because both are limited, particularly in regard to West Papua. So I argue that digital democratisation and grassroots activism, which to an extent ignores state borders, are bringing civil society in Australia and West Papua closer together, whilst driving the governments of Australia and Indonesia further apart. Similarly, it is the anti-democratic processes, rather than democratic advances, being progressively enacted within Indonesia and Australia with regard to West Papua that tend to bring the two countries at a state level closer together. So let me illustrate both of these processes, and I'll start with the latter. Much has been made of Indonesia's democratisation since the fall of Suharto in 1998, particularly since the implementation of electoral reforms from 1999 onward. However, democratic reforms have had a limited reach in West Papua. For example, in 2003, the province of Papua, which is known internationally as West Papua, was divided into two provinces, now known as Papua and West Papua, by the central government, and this was counter to local wishes and to national law. Local Papuan political parties are banned. Freeport-McMoran Mine, an American company that pays taxes to Jakarta, exploits West Papuan natural resources, wreaks havoc on the environment and local communities, yet yields negligible, if any, benefits to the Papuan people. The military operates with near impunity in West Papua. In December 2014, 4 unarmed West Papuan youths were killed and 17 more injured in Panyai when the Indonesian army and police opened fire on a group of protesters. Although an investigation into the massacre was opened, it has not been independent, but rather has been compromised by police involvement, and police were involved in the attack. So high hopes for democratic improvements in West Papua were held by the international community with the presidency of Joko Widodo. In his last visit to the region, Widodo released 5 political prisoners and announced that the ban on foreign journalists visiting West Papua would be lifted. However, West Papuan activists claim that the release of the 5 prisoners who asked for clemency, so 85 prisoners roundabout did not ask for clemency, saying that they hadn't done anything wrong, so why should they? But 5 of them did. But the activists in West Papua, many activists say that this move by Joko Widodo was at best tokenistic, as up to 500 student protesters were subsequently arrested in May and June after his gesture. Papua observers such as Human Rights Watch's Andreas Harsono also doubt the president's power to carry out such a trenchant change to the long-standing media blackout in West Papua, kept in place by 18 central government agencies operating a lucrative visa clearinghouse, who are unlikely to just let in any foreign journalists if they miss out on the profits of being involved in clearing their visas. So in recent years, as democratic processes have been rolled out in other parts of Indonesia, the Australian government has affirmed the Indonesian charade that those same processes are taking place in West Papua. In fact, Australia has maintained a pragmatic complicity in Indonesia's treatment of West Papua since Indonesia invaded the territory in 1962, and has done little to protest the litany of human rights crimes committed in the region, including the murder of up to 500,000 Papuans. In 1962, Australia's External Affairs Minister, Garfield Barwick, asserted that it was not in Australia's strategic interest to counter Indonesia's expansionary designs in West Papua. Australia would be better served, he argued, forging diplomatic ties with a preferably non-communist Indonesia. The Australian government therefore supported the international negotiations, including the 1962 New York Agreement and the 1969 Act of Free Choice, that sealed West Papua's fate as an annex to Indonesia. More recently, in 2006, as Japp mentioned, in 2006, Australia and Indonesia negotiated the Lombok Treaty, which contained a Papua clause, committing the Australian government to, quote, not in any manner support or participate in activities by any person or entity which constitutes a threat to the stability, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of the other party, including by those who seek to use its territory for encouraging or committing such activities, including separatism, in the territory of the other party, end quote. Signing this agreement signalled the Australian government's willingness to curtail the democratic freedoms of its own citizens in order to persuade Indonesia of its recognition of Indonesian sovereignty over West Papua. When Mako Tabuni, a West Papuan independence activist, was murdered in the street in Jayapura in 2012, eyewitnesses and, later, Australian investigative journalists from the ABC asserted that the murder was committed by the partially Australian-funded and trained Indonesian Anti-Terror Police Squad Detachment 88. In 2013, 3 West Papuan men climbed the walls of the Australian Consulate in Bali immediately prior to an anticipated visit by Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and these men were seeking refuge and calling for the release of political prisoners in West Papua. The Australian academic Clinton Fernandez was on the telephone to the consulate at the time of the incident, and he overheard an Australian voice threatening to bring in the Indonesian military and police to remove the Papuan men. The latter were forced to flee the consulate, afraid for their lives. In the aftermath of the incident, Abbott stated his desire to express in, quote, neon flashing lights, end quote, that attempts to grandstand against Indonesia by involving Australia were not welcome, asserting, as Australian leaders regularly do, that Australia respected Indonesia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Abbott added, following the lead of Indonesian leaders, that, quote, the situation in West Papua was getting better, not worse. So the combined efforts of the Indonesian and Australian governments to whitewash ongoing systematic brutalities in West Papua is not a done deal in perpetuum, however, and perhaps because most Australian statements regarding relations with Indonesia are prefaced with references to the Australian national interest, Indonesia knows Australian policy on West Papua is strategically and at times legally contingent. Precedents in the relationship of friction over contested Indonesian sovereignty in East Timor in 1990. Precedents in the relationship of friction over contested Indonesian territory exist. So in addition to Australia's about-face on supporting Indonesian sovereignty in East Timor in 1999, Australia also recognised 43 West Papuans who arrived in Australia in 2006 as legitimate asylum seekers and granted them temporary protection visas, prompting the Indonesian withdrawal of its ambassador from Australia. After allegations emerged in 2013 that Australia had been spying on Indonesian officials, and Indonesia responded by threatening to cease cooperation on managing people smuggling, Abbott reminded Indonesia that Australia had attempted to dissuade Australian-based West Papuan activists from travelling by boat to West Papua, effectively implying that Australian support for Indonesian sovereignty over West Papua was tied to cooperation from Indonesia on issues of Australian national concern. All of this goes to show that at a state level, both Australia and Indonesia are willing to exaggerate the extent of Indonesian democracy in West Papua and to collude to cover up direct violations of democracy. However, as neither country is acting altruistically with regard to West Papua, Indonesia is vested financially in occupying West Papua, and Australia is vested financially in appeasing Indonesia and thus condoning its occupation of West Papua, shifts in Australia's relations to West Papua are possible with changing political winds. For the time being, though, it appears that the strength of Australia-Indonesia ties in relation to West Papua is in inverse proportion to the degree of democracy afforded West Papuans and their Australian supporters. By contrast, real democratisation, by which I refer to coordinated purposeful action by and for the affected people, is occurring at grassroots activists and digital levels, linking West Papuan, Melanesian and Australian communities in solidarity against state-centric oppressive concepts of sovereignty. This is expressed in a burgeoning genre of West Papuan independence music being created by West Papuans and their Melanesian and Australian supporters and distributed digitally via YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, Bluetooth and SD cards through ever-expanding digital networks. While obviously the digital revolution has not impacted all populations equally and unequivocally for good, it has had the effect of spreading music, foundational to Melanesian cosmology, and the life force of West Papua's independence music movement, and lifting the profile of West Papuan struggle. Digital, including social media, has also elevated the urgency of the struggle in mainstream Australia and internationally, propelling the circulation of videos depicting the torture of West Papuans and attracting the intervention of internet activist hacker group Anonymous to intervene on behalf of West Papuans. So a grassroots activist movement recognising a shared history between Indigenous Papuans and Indigenous Australians of settler colonial violence and prehistoric cohabitation of the continent Sahul has emerged over the past 2 years, most dynamically in the initiative of the West Papua Freedom Flotilla. This project has involved 2 maritime missions with West Papuan and Aboriginal activists using Aboriginal passports and West Papuan visas in an effort to take water from Lake Eyre to West Papua, a form of non-violent direct action, highlighting West Papua's violent occupation and symbolising oceanic Indigenous articulations. 2 other events are notable with regard to West Papuan-led activism in Australia. In April 2014, an office opened in Perth to carry out the work of Oxford-based West Papuan refugee and independence activist Benny Wender's Free West Papua campaign. And in June 2014, I attended the opening of the Federal Republic of West Papua's Department of Foreign Affairs, Immigration and Trade, headed up by Foreign Minister Jaco Brumbiak, a former West Papuan political prisoner living in exile in Melbourne. The office was located in an architecturally slick, eco-friendly complex in Melbourne CBD, and its opening was officiated by a local government MP, an Aboriginal elder and a university academic. But both of these offices were established in contravention of the Lombok Treaty and remain in operation, demonstrating that grassroots people-led movements can thrive in the cracks of top-down and anti-democratic power. Supporters of the West Papuan rights movement in Australia tend to come in the form of networks of academics, artists and other activists belonging to the several Australia-West Papua associations. These networks often work in tandem. In July 2013, the West Papua Project at the University of Sydney produced a Citizens Tribunal, the first of its kind in Australia, weighing up the evidence and hearing testimonies from survivors of the 1998 Biak massacre, in which Indonesian security forces murdered up to 200 West Papuans demonstrating on the West Papuan island of Biak. The Indonesian military has never been held accountable for the massacre, and notable Australian legal personalities, concerned academics from institutions across Australia, and other activists cooperated in an effort to bring a degree of justice and closure to the victims, even in the absence of a legal remedy. In March this year, several of the tribunal team led by John Dowd and Eben Kirksey presented the evidence brief to Greens Party leader Richard Di Natale, Liberal MP Jane Prentice and Labor MPs Melissa Savage and Laurie Ferguson in federal parliament, and met with a favourable tripartisan reception, further evidence that small initiatives can reach the halls of power, if not the decision-making chambers, yet. Australian academics, and I'm thinking particularly some of the team affiliated with the West Papua Project at Sydney University, have also been involved with West Papuan efforts to make their political presence known in the Melanesian region, assisting the United Liberation Movement for West Papua to develop its latest submission for membership to the Melanesian Spearhead Group, the MSG. The MSG, a political bloc comprised of 4 Melanesian countries, PNG, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands and Fiji, and the Indigenous Kanak Independence Party in New Caledonia, the FLNKS. The MSG was formed in 1986 to lobby France for Kanaki independence, and West Papua has sought for several years membership to the group on similar grounds. A minority victory was celebrated last month by West Papuans and their supporters when West Papua was granted observer status to the MSG, although at the same meeting Indonesia was granted associate membership, a level up from what West Papuans received. And that overshadowed West Papuans' victory somewhat. But what the community-initiated grassroots human rights-geared activities of West Papuans in Australia and those of Australians working in solidarity with West Papuans demonstrate is that it's the bottom-up rather than the top-down actions in Australia and West Papua that are making tracks towards a democratic future for West Papuans, rather than Indonesian or Australian government efforts. I want to conclude by drawing your attention to a sobering phenomenon taking place in Australian West Papuan politics. Recently, a political party calling itself the Free West Papua Party formed in Perth, which is trading off the brand created by the dynamic West Papuan activist Benny Wenda and Australian human rights lawyer Jennifer Robinson, who launched the Free West Papua campaign in Perth. This party mixes anti-Muslim, anti-migrant, right-wing nationalist ideology with its stated aim to work for West Papuan independence, and just days ago its leader, Paul Madden, delivered a speech at a Reclaim Australia rally purporting to support West Papuan freedom in an era of Islamisation. What I seek to highlight here is that the fight for independence is not a religious one in West Papua, although it does at times take on religio-cultural overtones. Many West Papuans, including some independence leaders, are Muslim. Further, Indigenous Australians are protesting against the Reclaim Australia movement. If they aren't trying to reclaim Australia for so-called white mainstreamers, then it does not seem appropriate for an Australian political party to drag Indigenous West Papuans into the movement. Finally, as I mentioned, Indigenous West Papuans and Indigenous Australians are already working together on a dynamic movement to recognise Indigenous sovereignty in their respective lands in the Freedom Flotilla initiative. As an endogenous organic movement toward reclamation, surely that's one that as Australians we should be putting our energies into supporting. It is important that the Australian public does not take too narrow a view of Australian national interest. Our government has already made that mistake for us. Instead, let us follow the lead of Indigenous West Papuans and the Indigenous peoples of the land we call home in lobbying our government and demonstrating to our mainstream media that democracy in Indonesia and in Australia should not be solely for the benefit of privileged ethnicities and the already rich. A healthy relationship between the two countries would acknowledge in law and practice the traditional owners of the various territories comprising the two countries and open up space for peaceful, just explorations of self-determination, engaging Indigenous peoples as primary actors. Thank you.